In this lesson, what we're going to do is explain the parliamentary process for passing legislation. This is going to be relatively short because it is something of an easy concept to understand within the English legal system. So we're not going to spend too much time on it. Ultimately, this is just the various stages that a bill will go through before it receives royal assent and becomes a piece of legislation. We looked in the previous lesson at the ways in which the legislation will actually begin its life as a bill, the types of bills that are introduced, things like private members' bills, public versus private bills, and also hybrid bills. And this lesson, we're going to talk about how those bills then go through the various stages of the parliamentary process to become law, to become legislation, and receive royal assent from the monarch. Sorry. So let's begin then with the first of these issues. Let's just think about the various stages of parliamentary lawmaking in their generality. Let's just think about them in their sort of general form. So the parliamentary lawmaking process takes place in a number of stages, as you would probably imagine. There is a first reading, there is a second reading. The legislation then goes to what is known as a committee stage, which is then taken to the report stage, a third reading, and then it goes to the next chamber. Remember, we have a bicameral legislature in Westminster in the United Kingdom, and this means that there are two chambers. And so we go from the House of Commons to the House of Lords. And then finally, once it goes through the same stages in the House of Lords, then we see that it receives royal assent. And so let's think about what each of these stages means one at a time. Okay, let's look at what each of the things that are required at each stage, the relative amount of debate and formalities that take place at each stage, etc., etc. So the first reading of the bill is simply a very formal procedure of reading out the bill to the House of Commons. There is no room for debate. There is no room for deliberation on the bill at this stage, nor is there even a vote which takes place. Okay, so every single bill that is introduced that is going to go through the process will receive a first reading. And there will be no vote on whether or not to take the bill any further. That takes place in further readings. What does happen at the first reading stage, however, is there will be a declaration of compatibility made. So not only will the bill be read, but it will also be made clear that the legislation is seen to be compatible with the Human Rights Act. This is part of the legislation of the Human Rights Act, and it is a requirement for legislation to essentially adhere to the Human Rights Act. We then go to the second reading. This is where there is a lot more debate and discussion on the bill where this takes place. The aim of the second reading is not to necessarily get bogged down within the specific details of potential legislation. Rather, and instead, it is to focus on the intent of the bill itself. So talking about more the broader overarching themes of the legislation, the passing of the legislation, rather than necessarily focusing on the detailed specificities of the bill itself. Okay, that's what the second reading exists to do. At the end of the second reading, there will also be a vote on whether or not to take the bill to the next stage. So this is the first part where we start to see the various different votes being taken place on the bill itself. This will either be done verbally by the Speaker. If there is no objection, then at which point the bill will go to the next stage. If it is not clear that there is an indication of support for the bill, then the Speaker will declare division and a formal vote will take place. This is where there will be two lobbies. The MPs will walk either through one lobby or the other lobby, depending on whether or not they support or oppose the bill, and then we get the vote on it. If the bill passes the second reading, if it passes this vote stage, then it will go to the committee stage, which is the third element of the legislative process. This is where the finer details of the bill are discussed and debated. A committee will consist of a selection of members of Parliament. Now, this is supposed to roughly match the composition of the House of Commons. So if, for example, as we have today, we have a Conservative government and we have quite a sizable Labour opposition with some other smaller parties involved as well, Given that this is the case, a committee will consist mostly of Conservative MPs with a percentage of Labour, Liberal Democrat, SNP, etc., etc. And so, to be fair, the way in which the percentage of MPs, depending on which party, sits in the House of Commons, will depend on the consistency of the committee itself. Here, this is where a number of various amendments will be made to the legislation, and then they will be voted on in the committee in question. So the committee stage is a far more detailed and nuanced stage of the process. This is where some more of the finer details are discussed and proposed and reformed and amended, and ultimately we get a more refined version of the bill following the committee stage. Stage 4 then is the report stage. If there is a number of amendments, or any amendment that is made to the bill in the committee stage, then it will go back to the House of Commons and be reported back to the House of Commons as part of the report stage. Okay? The House of Commons will then be able to debate those amendments and vote on whether or not they ought to be accepted or rejected. If there are no amendments during the committee stage, if no changes are made during the committee stage, then there will be no need for a report stage. So there wouldn't be a report stage if there are no amendments or changes that are made to the committee stage. Finally, then, we have the third reading of the bill. This is also simply a formality process. This is just where we see the final vote on the bill. It is unlikely that you will ever see a bill fail at this stage, because if it has gone through the second reading and the committee stage, and it has gone through the report stage, and it has garnered the support of the majority of members of Parliament, then at this point the bill is unlikely going to fail. There's unlikely going to be a change of heart from a number of MPs at this point, but sometimes this can happen. When this takes place and we go through the third reading and the piece of legislation, or the bill should I say, passes through the third reading, it again gets sent to the House of Lords. Once passed through the Commons, it goes to the House of Lords, where it will go through the same process. It will go through a number of reading processes, it will go through a committee process, a report stage, and a third reading. Where the Lords has made amendments to the bill, it will get sent back to the House of Commons for approval. So the House of Lords cannot make amendments to the bill and then push it through to royal assent. Any amendments or changes that are made in the House of Lords has to go back to the House of Commons to be voted on by the democratically elected members of Parliament. Sometimes there will be a back and forth that takes place where there are various amendments that are made by the Lords that goes back to the Commons, that goes back to the Lords again, and this is a process known as ping-ponging. But assuming that it passes through all of these stages, it goes back to the Commons approves of the amendments or overrules the House of Lords if they don't approve of the amendments, and it goes all the way through to the final stage, we get the point of royal assent. This is, again, another formal process, a formality, where the monarch will give royal assent to create the legislation, to turn the bill into law. Now, ever since the Royal Assent Act of 1967, the monarch doesn't even get to read the legislation. They get the title of the legislation and they get told to sign it or to give their assent. So this is just goes to show just how much of a formality this process is. They don't even read or consider the legislation itself. The last time a monarch refused royal assent was Queen Anne in 1707. So this is just, again, a relatively useless formal process. And so at which point the legislation becomes law. Now, if there is no specific time in which the legislation is set to enter into force, so for example, the Human Rights Act was passed in 1998, but it was set to enter into force in 2000, if that doesn't exist, then it will be said to enter into force at midnight on the day of receiving royal assent, so essentially the day after receiving royal assent. That is the process by which a bill goes through Parliament and is created into law.